Zika in Florida. Just a few moments ago, Congresswoman Debbie Wasserman Schultz, representing South Florida, talking about the Zika virus. She is still speaking at the podium. Let's listen in.
It's the first day of school. We all want our kids to be able to play outside and fully enjoy their lives, but this crisis is turning that prospect into a daily nightmare. Hand-wringing every single day. Is my child protected? Are they wearing enough protective clothing? Do they have bug repellent on? That's happening all over our state. And make no mistake, this will and already is affecting people's travel plans to South Florida. I personally know 2 young pregnant women whose doctors up north told them to avoid coming to South Florida because of the vulnerability, and we know that will continue. The federal government is doing all it can now to respond to this virus with the resources that it has, but right now those resources are simply inadequate. President Obama requested $1.9 billion in emergency funding nearly 6 months ago, and the administration's public health officials from the Centers for Disease Control and the National Institutes of Health repeatedly briefed Congress on why this emergency funding was needed and how it would be spent. Those agencies are working hard to contain and stop the virus's transmission, and they are researching a vaccine. Unfortunately, Congressional Republicans have repeatedly refused to take meaningful action to address this crisis. They refused to fully fund the president's emergency request, and their alternative was simply to use money set aside for the Ebola crisis and rob Peter to pay Paul in order to stick a finger in the dike and hopefully hold back the crisis. They have repeatedly voted down measures supporting the emergency funding, including my bill that I introduced to introduce the president's emergency supplemental request with Rosa DeLauro and Nita Lowey, my colleagues on the Appropriations Committee, and they have continuously defeated amendments in every single appropriations bill that we introduced that would address this crisis with that funding. Their delays and obstruction have gone far past any budgetary concerns. They've even gone so far as to block any funds from going to family planning services for a virus that affects pregnant women. And perhaps most egregiously, their decision to send Congress home for the longest summer recess in 50 years means they are actively hurting our nation's response to this crisis. And we've repeatedly called for Congress to end this session and come back to Congress, come back to Washington, and do the right thing and appropriate these funds now. But they've steadfastly refused to do so, preferring to ignore the problem, keep their fingers crossed, squeeze their eyes shut, and hope it goes away, even as it gets worse on multiple fronts. In fact, their refusal to provide additional funding is endangering now our government's ability to develop a vaccine. The funding for vaccine research was slated to run out at the end of September. 2 weeks ago, I led a letter of Florida Democrats to Health and Human Services Secretary Sylvia Burwell to urge her, because HHS has no other choice, to move money from other projects into Zika vaccine research. I typically would not urge HHS to do that, but Congressional Republicans left us with absolutely no choice. Vaccine research needs sustained,
Florida Congresswoman Debbie Wasserman Schultz there, who represents one of the so-called Zika hot zones there, 2 areas in South Florida where officials have said the Zika virus exists now. Federal health officials urging pregnant women to stay away from this part of South Florida. Congresswoman Wasserman Schultz calling on her colleagues to fund the fight. Some $1.9 billion requested by the White House roughly 6 months ago. Congresswoman Wasserman Schultz there saying, quote, we hate to say we told you so. The Clinton